The twin moons of Velis Prime glowed softly over the alien academy, their light reflecting off the glass towers and silver walkways of a place built for peace. It was a grand academy where students from hundreds of species studied together, young minds learning science, strategy, and diplomacy to build a better galaxy. The air was usually filled with laughter and chatter in many languages, the hum of drones cleaning the halls and the gentle thrum of the academy's shield generators. Among the many species walking its halls were the humans, newcomers to the galactic community, often underestimated, often called the primitives from Sol. But those who knew them closely had already learned that humans had something rare, a stubbornness that burned brighter than any star. On that calm evening, no one expected that peace would end in fire and blood. Without warning, the peace shattered. From the blackness of space, a vast shape appeared, a hunter-class dreadnought, its armor jagged and alive with red energy veins. It moved like a beast, not a ship, and its arrival was silent until the first plasma strike hit the defense grid. The blast turned night into burning daylight. Towers cracked, alarms screamed, and the sky itself seemed to open as dropships poured out like a swarm of shadows. The Academy's defense systems tried to respond, but the first wave was already inside the perimeter. The attackers were the Catharn, ancient predators, feared across the stars, creatures of muscle, bone, and hatred. They had vanished from galactic history centuries ago, thought to have destroyed themselves in endless war. Now they had returned, and their return was a nightmare. Students and teachers ran for cover. Shouts in many alien tongues filled the comms. Some tried to fight back, but the Catharn moved like ghosts, their stealth fields flickering as they cut through corridors with invisible blades. One by one the sentries fell. The Academy's elegant halls, once filled with music and learning, became hunting grounds. Drones exploded, crystals shattered, fire spread. Amid the chaos, a single bone-shaking roar rolled through the Academy's heart. It was not just a sound. It was a declaration. The Catharn warlord himself had landed. His presence made the air vibrate. Every species in the galaxy knew that sound from legend, the roar of the great hunter, the last of the Catharn kings. In the midst of all this destruction, deep inside the nursery wing of the Academy, two small shapes trembled in a corner. They were Catharn cubs, tiny, wide-eyed, their scales dull with fear. They were not with their kind, not trained for battle. They had been raised among the alien students, cared for by scientists, nurtured in peace. And the one watching over them that night was a human, Commander Riley Vance. She had been assigned to the Academy as a tactical instructor, a veteran of Earth's Defense Force who had seen more than her share of battles. When she had first found the cubs years ago on a ruined planet, she had refused to leave them behind, even when her own people told her it was a mistake. Now, as the ground shook and fire rained from the sky, Riley stood guard over them, holding her weapon, ready to protect the two lives she had chosen to raise as her own. The Academy trembled again as another explosion ripped through the eastern wing. Through the smoke and flashing red lights, Riley could see the silhouette of the enemy landing ships approaching. The roar came again, closer this time. The warlord had come to reclaim something that was his by blood. But Riley Vance was not the kind to surrender easily. She looked down at the cubs, their eyes wide with fear, and whispered softly, "It's going to be all right. I've got you." Outside, the hunters prepared to strike again, but inside that broken academy, one human stood between them and their prize, calm, fierce, and ready to fight. The night of terror had begun, and the fate of the academy, and perhaps much more, rested on the courage of a single woman who refused to run. Commander Riley Vance had never planned to become a caretaker, let alone for two alien cubs from a species known for destruction. Years ago, during a mission on the burnt-out planet of Carthos IV, she had found the small Catharn cubs alone in the ruins of a fallen war camp. Their parents had likely been among the dead, warriors consumed by their endless hunger for battle. The cubs had been weak, hungry, and too young to understand the world around them. Something in Riley's heart refused to leave them behind. She had already seen too many children, human and alien alike, lost to war. So, against the advice of her commanding officers, she brought them with her. People said she was insane, that predators couldn't be tamed, that she was risking her life and others. The alien scholars at the academy whispered that when the cubs grew older, their instincts would return, and they would tear her apart. But none of that happened. Under her care, the cubs learned kindness. They laughed, played, and followed her everywhere. They called her mother in the broken mix of words and growls they could form. To them, she was not prey, not food, not an enemy. She was home. Now that fragile peace was falling apart around her. The Catharn had returned from extinction, led by a warlord whose ships filled the sky like dark wings. The academy was burning, and the air was thick with smoke and fear. Riley could hear the distant cries of the wounded and the echo of gunfire in the halls. The defensive systems were collapsing. The teachers were evacuating the students, but there was no safe path left. The warlord's voice boomed across the communication channels in a deep, rumbling growl that made even the bravest soldiers tremble. His words were simple and cruel. Return the offspring. The human dies slow. Riley froze for a heartbeat when she heard that. It meant they were looking for her, for the cubs. Somehow, through blood scent or genetic signal, the Catharn had found out that their young lived here. And they wanted them back, not out of love, but because the cubs represented legacy and power. Holding the cubs close, Riley ran through the damaged corridors of the academy. The air was hot from fires and sparks fell like burning snow. The younger cub whimpered in fear while the older one growled low, trying to sound brave. She moved with calm focus, her mind scanning for options. The nearest evacuation point was already gone, crushed under debris from the upper towers. She switched to her tactical visor, scanning for a new path. Every exit she found was crawling with enemy life signs. The Catharn were fast and ruthless, cutting through security drones like toys. The smell of plasma burns and melted metal filled the air. But Riley was not new to chaos. She had fought in worse places: human colony wars, asteroid sieges, the dark campaign over Tau Serpentis. She knew how to move through hell and make it out breathing. She slipped into the maintenance tunnels, crouching low, guiding the cubs silently through the narrow space. The older cub's claws scratched the metal, but Riley shushed him gently. "Quiet, little one," she whispered. "We're almost there." She could hear the heavy thuds of armored feet above. The hunters spreading through the academy, searching. The comms were flooded with distress signals, but she ignored them. Her priority was clear: protect the cubs at all costs. As she crawled out into a dim hallway, a sudden explosion rocked the ground. Dust rained from the ceiling, and one of the cubs cried out in terror. Riley lifted them both, heart pounding, and sprinted toward the lower decks. Her lungs burned, her muscles screamed, but she didn't slow down. At last, she reached the emergency bay, a vast open area lined with escape pods. Half of them were already gone, their trails streaking across the sky like dying stars. The other half were locked, unpowered, or damaged. She cursed under her breath. "Of course," she muttered. "Nothing's ever easy." Then the intercom buzzed again, the warlord's voice, louder now, closer. "You cannot hide the blood of Catharn, human." Riley felt the cubs trembling against her chest. She knelt, looked into their glowing eyes, and said softly, "Not today." Her words were steady, full of fire. Somewhere far above, in the chaos of orbit, ships were battling for the planet's fate. But here, in the broken heart of the academy, a single human mother prepared to face a nightmare from legend. And she wasn't afraid. High above Velis Prime, the stars had turned into fire. The peaceful orbit that once shimmered with transport shuttles and study satellites was now a war zone. The great Catharn dreadnought loomed over the planet like a black sun, its hull covered in jagged armor plates and glowing red energy veins. It was a monster of metal, feeding on the light of the system's twin suns. Every few seconds, a wave of plasma fire erupted from its cannons, lighting up the darkness like thunder made visible. Against this massive beast, a small fleet of defense ships formed a desperate line. Among them was the Resolute, a human corvette, fast, light, and built for courage more than survival. It had taken heavy damage already, its shields flickering, but it held position at the front of the fleet. In its command chair sat Lieutenant Jin Ho, once Commander Riley Vance's brightest student at the academy. He had learned from her how to keep calm when everything burned, and now her lessons were being tested in the most brutal way imaginable. "Status report," Jin barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. Sparks flew from a damaged console, and smoke curled through the bridge. Shields at 32%, replied the tactical officer, her hands shaking as she worked the controls. Forward battery still online, but we've lost engine stability. Jin gritted his teeth. On the main display, the dreadnought filled the screen, impossibly huge, its energy core pulsing like a beating heart. Target their main thrusters, he ordered. All ships, focus fire. The fleet responded, hundreds of energy beams lancing toward the enemy. The hits flared against its armor, leaving molten scars, but the dreadnought didn't slow. Instead, its plasma lances fired again, cutting through 3 defense ships in a single shot. The explosion spread like a dying sun, and debris rained toward the planet below. Jin steadied himself against the shockwave. He knew they were outmatched, but he also knew retreat wasn't an option. The enemy wasn't here just to destroy the Academy. They were here for something else, something personal to their warlord. And that something was still down there with Riley. Open fleet channel, he said, his voice cold and clear. This is Lieutenant Jin Ho, commander of the Resolute. Commander Vance is still planetside. We hold this line until she's safe. The comm crackled with responses, alien captains, human lieutenants, even automated drones acknowledging his order. Some of them were already burning, but they turned their ships back toward the dreadnought anyway. It wasn't about rank or orders anymore. They all knew who Riley Vance was. The human who trained soldiers of every species. The woman who had once faced down pirates on her own to protect unarmed cadets. She had earned their loyalty long before this battle. The Resolute surged forward, engines flaring blue. Jin's hands flew across the controls, his mind a storm of calculations and instinct. Lock on to their upper vents, he commanded. If we can't destroy them, we'll blind them. The ship's cannons fired again and again, shaking the hull with each shot. The dreadnought responded with fury, sending waves of plasma and guided missiles. One hit tore into the Resolute's flank, throwing the crew to the floor. Alarms screamed. Fire erupted from the rear deck. Jin pushed himself up, wiping blood from his brow, and shouted, "Damage control teams, seal off Section 7! We're not done yet!" For a moment, the bridge fell silent except for the sound of crackling flames and beeping consoles. Outside, the sky burned with trails of light. Ships exploding, fragments spinning into the atmosphere. Jin looked toward Velis Prime, the planet glowing beneath them, and thought of his old commander. He pictured her standing in that academy, protecting those cubs, facing the impossible with the same fierce calm she always carried. He drew a slow breath and whispered, "You taught me to never give up. So we won't." He opened the fleet channel once more, his voice steady despite the chaos. "To all remaining ships," he said, "target their main power lines. Don't let that monster near the surface. Hold the line." One by one, the voices of humans and aliens alike answered him. Holding. For the Academy. For Commander Vance. The small fleet turned toward the giant once more, their guns lighting the void in a storm of defiance. They were outnumbered, outgunned, but they were human-led, and that meant they would fight until the last light in the sky went out. The ground of Velis Prime trembled as the battle above raged on, the thunder of explosions echoing across the ruined academy. Smoke rose from burning towers, and the once bright courtyards were now buried in rubble and ash. Commander Riley Vance moved through the wreckage, clutching her rifle in one hand and guiding the 2 Catharn cubs with the other. Her uniform was torn, her face streaked with dirt and blood, but her eyes burned with steady determination. The emergency bay she had hoped to reach was gone, buried under a collapsed ceiling. Every hallway was filled with danger, collapsing walls, enemy patrols, the distant roar of alien beasts. The Catharn invaders hunted in small groups, their stealth cloaks flickering in and out of view as they searched for their warlord's lost bloodline. Riley had seen them twice already, shimmering shapes with glowing red eyes, but she had managed to stay ahead of them by knowing the Academy's structure better than anyone else. Now she moved into the central courtyard, the heart of the Academy. What was once a garden filled with glowing trees and flowing fountains had become a graveyard of shattered glass and twisted metal. The planet's twin moons cast a pale light through the smoke, turning everything silver and ghostly. Riley stopped for a moment, breathing hard, scanning the shadows. She could hear the soft whimpers of the younger cub behind her. "Stay close," she whispered. Her instincts told her something was wrong. The air felt heavy, the way it did just before a storm. Then she heard it, a sound that made her blood run cold. A deep, resonant roar rolled across the courtyard, shaking the ground and the broken walls. It wasn't the growl of a scout or a soldier. It was something far greater. The warlord had arrived. A shape descended from the sky in a blaze of red fire. The air shimmered around him as his armor absorbed the heat of re-entry. He landed like a meteor, cracking the marble beneath his feet. The warlord of the Catharn was enormous, taller than any human, his black armor plated with bones and glowing with red veins of energy. His eyes burned like embers, and his breath came out in visible bursts of steam. When he straightened, he looked around the ruins until his gaze fell on Riley. Then he spoke, his voice like thunder rolling through the air. "Human," he growled, "you have what belongs to me." His language was ancient, but she understood him through her translator chip. She didn't lower her weapon. "They belong to no one," she said. "They're not yours to claim." The warlord took a step forward, his claws scraping against stone. "They carry my blood," he rumbled. "They are Catharn, my heirs." "You have stolen them." Riley held her ground, even though every instinct screamed at her to run. "I saved them," she said, her voice low but firm. "You left them to die." Her words made the warlord's mandibles flare wide in fury. He roared again, a sound that shattered what was left of the courtyard's glass towers. The cubs cried out in fear and ran to hide behind her legs. The warlord's head snapped toward them. For the first time, his anger faltered. He looked down at the two small shapes clutching the human's legs, their eyes wide and filled with confusion. They looked like him, same scales, same ridges, but they didn't move like predators. They didn't snarl or bare their teeth. They looked afraid. Riley saw the hesitation in his eyes and seized the moment. She raised her weapon and fired a burst straight at his chest. The plasma shots hit his armor, burning bright but failing to pierce through. The warlord staggered but did not fall. His rage returned in an instant. With a roar, he lunged forward faster than she could move. His massive arm struck her side, throwing her through the air. She hit the ground hard, her rifle skidding away. Pain shot through her ribs, but she pushed herself up, gasping. The warlord advanced, ready to finish her. Then he stopped. Between them stood the two cubs, trembling but defiant, their small bodies blocking his path. They hissed and growled, not at Riley but at him. The warlord froze, confusion flickering across his monstrous face. For a heartbeat, the world went still. The burning wreckage around them faded into silence. Riley rose slowly, her hand pressed to her bleeding side, and stepped forward until she was beside the cubs. They pressed against her legs, looking up at her for courage. The warlord's gaze moved between her and the young ones. Something ancient shifted in his expression. Not anger, not pride, but something like disbelief. For the first time in his long, brutal life, the great predator hesitated. Riley stood in the center of the shattered courtyard, her body aching, her armor scorched, and her lungs burning from the smoke that drifted through the night air. The warlord towered before her, a creature of darkness and fury, his red eyes glowing like molten stone. Around them, the academy lay in ruins, broken towers leaning against each other, fires burning through the remains of classrooms and laboratories. Yet in that moment, all the destruction seemed to fade, leaving only the quiet tension between them. The two cubs pressed close to Riley's legs, trembling but refusing to leave her side. The warlord's massive claws lowered, his breath heavy and uneven. For the first time since the battle began, he did not move forward. His instincts screamed at him to strike, to finish what he had started, but something inside him hesitated. The scent in the air told him the truth. These cubs, his blood, no longer smelled like his kind. They carried the faint, unmistakable scent of a human. They were not his anymore. At least not entirely. They belonged to something new. Riley met his gaze without fear. Her voice was quiet but strong. "You left them to die," she said. "I didn't." The words cut through the smoky air like a blade. The warlord growled low, his chest rising and falling with deep, rumbling breaths. He could crush her in a heartbeat. He could destroy everything she had built with these young ones. But his eyes kept returning to the cubs, who stared back at him, confused, afraid, yet somehow defiant. They had grown under the care of a creature he once considered prey. They had learned compassion, not violence. They had learned to stand beside her, not behind her. The warlord had fought countless enemies, conquered planets, and crushed armies. but he had never faced something like this. A bond that defied the laws of blood and war. Riley took a slow step forward, her hand resting protectively on one cub's head. "They are safe with me," she said. "I've taught them what you never did. How to care, how to choose who they want to be." The warlord's claws twitched, his jaw tightening as he stared at her. The silence stretched between them, thick with tension and disbelief. Then, without warning, the ground shook violently, a deep rumble that came from above rather than below. Both of them turned their heads to the sky. The clouds split apart as a bright light tore through them. The Resolute was descending, burning through the atmosphere with engines at full power. The human ship, battered and broken from battle, had one last mission left to complete. Riley's earpiece crackled with static, and through it came Jin Ho's voice, strained but steady. "Commander," he said, "this is for you." Riley looked up, eyes wide, as the ship began its final dive. The dreadnought that had filled the sky moments ago was still firing, but the Resolute didn't turn away. It plunged forward, engines screaming, carrying a payload that would ignite the enemy's reactor from within. The light grew brighter and brighter, until the night became day. The explosion came seconds later, a massive blue-white wave of fire that spread across the clouds, splitting the heavens apart. The shockwave rolled over the planet, shaking the ruins and knocking both Riley and the warlord to the ground. She covered the cubs with her body, shielding them from falling debris. The air filled with the roar of destruction, then silence. When the rumbling faded, Riley lifted her head. The sky was a swirling canvas of smoke and light. The dreadnought was gone. In its place hung a spreading field of glowing debris, slowly drifting apart like shattered stars. She looked around. The courtyard was in ruins, but still standing. The warlord lay nearby, his armor cracked, steam rising from the wounds that covered him. He struggled to rise, but then stopped, breathing heavily. His gaze found Riley again, and for a moment there was no hatred in it, only respect and perhaps sorrow. The cubs crawled toward him, unsure, their small claws scraping the broken floor. They looked at him with curiosity, not fear. The warlord stared at them for a long moment, his chest heaving, then turned his gaze back to Riley. Slowly, almost painfully, he gave a small nod, a gesture of honor, of understanding. Riley didn't speak. She simply returned the nod, her expression calm and tired. The warlord lowered his head, closing his eyes. His great body went still, the red light fading from his armor until all that was left was silence. The cubs whimpered softly and turned back to her. She gathered them close, holding them against her chest, her heart heavy but proud. Above them, the sky still burned with the remains of the human ship, a final light of sacrifice, a symbol of the courage that defined her kind. And as Riley stood in the ruins of the academy, the predator gone, the battle ended, she knew that something greater had just been born. Not victory or vengeance, but understanding. The fires of battle slowly faded, leaving behind a world of smoke, silence, and scattered light. The once great alien academy was now a skeleton of what it had been, its silver towers cracked and leaning, its gardens reduced to ash. But life still moved among the ruins. Emergency lights flickered weakly, and the faint hum of surviving drones echoed through the air. Commander Riley Vance stood at the edge of the courtyard, the two Catharn cubs huddled close against her sides. Her uniform was torn, her face streaked with dirt and blood, but her eyes still burned with quiet strength. The air smelled of metal and ozone, and the sky above her shimmered with the remnants of the great explosion that had ended the battle. The Resolute was gone, along with every brave soul who had chosen to hold the line. Their sacrifice had torn the Catharn dreadnought apart, ending the invasion in a single blinding act of courage. Pieces of the enemy ship still fell from the heavens, glowing trails fading into the morning light. Riley knelt beside the fallen warlord, his massive body motionless, armor cracked open and leaking dark blood onto the broken stones. His breathing was slow, ragged, and growing weaker with each second. Even in defeat, he looked powerful, a creature born for war, brought low not by strength, but by something he could never understand. When he opened his eyes, the burning red light had dimmed, replaced by something faintly human. Exhaustion, regret, maybe even respect. The cubs stepped forward hesitantly, their small claws clicking against the marble floor. They looked down at the warlord with wide eyes, sensing the end of something they could not name. He turned his head toward them and made a soft, low growl, not a command, but a sound of recognition. Then he looked at Riley. For a long moment, neither spoke. No translator was needed. They understood each other in silence. At last, the warlord gave a slow, heavy nod, a gesture that carried the weight of an ancient warrior's honor. Then his body went still, and the light in his eyes faded forever. The cubs made small, sorrowful sounds, pressing close to Riley. She put a hand on each of their heads, feeling their trembling calm under her touch. "It's over," she whispered, though her voice trembled too. Above them, the first rays of dawn broke through the clouds, shining on the wreckage, on the fires, on the scars left behind. For the first time in what felt like forever, the air was quiet. Ships from allied species began descending from orbit, their rescue lights cutting through the smoke. Medics, engineers, and soldiers poured out, helping survivors from the ruins. They stopped when they saw Riley standing there, framed by the sunrise, the two cubs beside her. To many of them, she was already a legend. The human who had faced a warlord and lived, the woman who had protected life instead of taking it. In the days that followed, the survivors rebuilt what they could. The academy rose again from the ashes, piece by piece, its towers repaired, its halls cleaned, its purpose renewed. But it was no longer just a school for knowledge. It became a symbol of unity, proof that even in the darkest moments, understanding could grow between species once divided by fear. At the center of the new courtyard stood a statue made of silver and dark stone. It showed a human woman standing tall, two small Catharn cubs by her side, all three looking toward the stars. Beneath it were words carved in every known galactic language. Strength is not in species, but in heart. Riley stayed at the academy, continuing her work as an instructor, but her lessons changed. She no longer taught just tactics in combat. She taught empathy, courage, and the power of choice. The cubs grew under her care, learning not to fight out of hatred, but to defend what was right. The story of that day spread across the galaxy, the day the predator struck and froze at the sight of its own young standing beside a human. It became a story whispered in the halls of starships, told to soldiers and children alike. Humanity, once seen as fragile and small, was now known as something greater, a species that stood for hope. And as the stars of Velis Prime burned bright in the night sky, Riley often looked up at them, thinking of Jin Ho and the brave crew of the Resolute, whose sacrifice had made peace possible. She would close her eyes, smile softly, and whisper to the stars, "We made it." The galaxy had learned something that day, that true strength was not in claws or weapons, but in compassion, in loyalty, and in the heart of a human who refused to give up.